The rain fell in sheets across the cobblestone streets of Prague, turning the ancient city into a shimmering mirror of gaslight and shadow. Viktor Moravec stood beneath the archway of the Charles Bridge, watching the Vltava River churn below, swollen with the autumn storm. The year was 1847, and the city pulsed with revolution's whisper, but Viktor's concerns stretched far beyond mortal politics. He had been 28 years old for 3 centuries. The transformation had come without warning on a winter night in 1547, when Prague still belonged wholly to the Holy Roman Empire. Viktor had been a physician's apprentice, returning home through the Jewish quarter after tending to a merchant's fevered child. The creature that attacked him in the narrow alley behind the old new synagogue moved with impossible speed. He remembered the cold fingers on his throat, the searing pain, and then a darkness deeper than any natural sleep. When he woke 3 days later in a crypt beneath the tan church, the world had changed. Collars sang with intensity that hurt his eyes. Every sound arrived as a symphony of discrete components. The smell of blood called to him like a siren song, and the hunger gnawed at his belly with teeth sharper than any mortal pain. His maker never appeared. No ancient vampire emerged to guide him through his transformation, to teach him the rules of this new existence. Viktor learned through trial and terrible error. He discovered that sunlight brought agony, but not instant death. That he could survive on animal blood, though it never truly satisfied. That mirrors showed his reflection just fine, but photographs captured only a blur. The old myths were a mixture of truth and fiction, and he had spent 300 years separating one from the other. Tonight, Viktor waited for someone. The message had arrived 2 weeks earlier, slipped under his door in an envelope sealed with black wax. The handwriting was elegant, antiquated, the kind of script that belonged to a different age entirely. It contained only an address, a date, and a time. No signature, no explanation, but Viktor recognized the style of the letters. He had seen it before, in his first years as a vampire, on a wanted poster in Vienna. The name had been Katerina Blackwood. She appeared as midnight approached, materializing from the rain like a ghost, achieving temporary solidity. Her dark hair hung in wet ropes down her back, and her dress belonged to no particular era Viktor could identify. It combined elements of a dozen different centuries, as though she had stopped caring about keeping current with fashion sometime around the Renaissance. Her face was perfect in the way that vampire faces often were, preserved at the peak of human beauty, unmarred by age or weather or time. But her eyes carried the weight of years. Viktor had learned to read age in the eyes of his kind. This woman had seen centuries pass. She studied him for a long moment, rain streaming down her pale skin, before she spoke. Her voice carried the accent of old England, not the modern sort, but something from the Tudor period, softened by time but never quite lost. She told him her name was indeed Katerina, and that she had been searching for him for a very long time. Not him specifically, but someone like him. Someone made without a maker's guidance. Someone who had survived alone. Viktor invited her to his home, a converted warehouse in the old town that had served as his sanctuary for the past 40 years. Inside, surrounded by the books and instruments he had collected across the centuries, Katerina told him her story. She had been turned in 1523 by a vampire named Marcus, who claimed to be over 1,000 years old. Marcus belonged to something he called the Bloodline, an organization of ancient vampires who followed strict rules about creation and control. Every vampire was supposed to be made deliberately, taught carefully, and integrated into the hierarchy. Rogue vampires, those who turned humans carelessly or who operated outside the system, were hunted and destroyed. Katerina had been Marcus's companion for 2 centuries before she began to question the Bloodline's methods. She saw how they treated newly turned vampires as property, how they enforced their rules with brutal efficiency, how they eliminated any vampire who showed independence or creativity. When she tried to leave, Marcus hunted her across Europe. She had been running for over a century, searching for others like her who might help build something different. Viktor listened, recognizing his own history in her words. He had encountered the bloodline twice before. The first time, in 1623, a vampire named Sebastian had tried to recruit him, speaking of duty and tradition. When Viktor refused, Sebastian had attempted to destroy him. The fight had been brutal, but Viktor discovered that his years of surviving alone had made him stronger and more resourceful than vampires raised in the bloodline's protected hierarchy. Sebastian had fled after Viktor set fire to his temporary haven. The second encounter came in 1789, during the chaos of the French Revolution. A bloodline enforcer tracked Viktor to Paris, intent on executing him for existing outside their control. That fight had ended with the enforcer's destruction, his ashes scattered in the Seine. Katerina proposed an alliance. She had found 3 other rogue vampires in the past decade, all of them made without proper guidance, all of them surviving in the margins of vampire society. Together, they could resist the bloodline's authority. They could create a different way of existing, one based on choice rather than hierarchy. Viktor considered her offer through the night. By dawn, he had agreed. The alliance grew slowly. Katerina introduced Viktor to the others over the following months. There was Dmitri, a Russian turned in the chaos of the Mongol invasions, who had spent 6 centuries wandering the steppes. There was Yuki, made in feudal Japan by a vampire, who had immediately been destroyed by a demon hunter, leaving her to figure out her nature alone. And there was James, an American turned during the Revolutionary War by a vampire who had sailed back to Europe and never returned. Each of them carried the particular strength that came from surviving without guidance. They had learned to adapt, to improvise, to think beyond the rigid structures the bloodline enforced. They met irregularly, sharing information and resources, always careful to avoid drawing the bloodline's attention. For 20 years, the arrangement worked. Viktor continued his existence in Prague, pursuing his long-standing interest in medicine and science. The transformation that had made him a vampire had also frozen his mind at its peak, giving him perfect recall and endless time to study. He had watched medicine evolve from crude humoral theory to something approaching genuine understanding. He filled notebooks with observations about vampire physiology, trying to understand the biological mechanisms that sustained his impossible existence. The work consumed him. He discovered that vampire blood carried something he could only describe as active patterns, structures too complex to be simple proteins or cells. They seemed to reorganize whatever they touched, rewriting biology at a fundamental level. The transformation process worked by replacing human blood entirely with this strange substance, which then maintained and repaired the body indefinitely. He tested animal blood versus human blood, and found that human blood carried something the vampire patterns needed to maintain full strength. Animal blood provided sustenance, but long-term reliance on it led to a gradual weakening. The moral implications haunted him. He had spent 3 centuries finding ways to feed without killing, taking small amounts from many sources, using his medical knowledge to identify people who could safely spare the blood. But the hunger never completely disappeared. In 1867, the fragile peace shattered. Dmitri sent word that the bloodline had discovered their alliance. Someone had betrayed them, though Dmitri died before he could identify who. His final message arrived as a package containing his severed hand, the fingers arranged to point toward Vienna. The others scattered. Viktor received a brief letter from Yuki, saying she was returning to Japan where she had connections among vampires who operated outside the bloodline's influence. James simply disappeared, leaving no word. Only Katerina remained in contact. She arrived in Prague 3 weeks after Dmitri's death, moving with the paranoid caution of someone truly hunted. She brought news that Marcus, her original maker, led the force sent to destroy them. He had convinced the Bloodline's council that rogue vampires represented an existential threat to their carefully maintained secrecy. Viktor and Katerina spent months preparing for the confrontation they knew was coming. They gathered weapons, identified bolt holes across the city, and studied everything they could learn about Marcus and his methods. Katerina described him as brilliant and utterly ruthless, a vampire who had survived a millennium by being more cunning than his enemies and more brutal than his allies. The attack came on a winter night, during a concert at the Estates Theater. Viktor had gone to hear a performance of Don Giovanni, maintaining the pretense of normal life even as he watched for threats. He sensed them in the interval, 3 vampires moving through the crowd with predatory focus. He slipped out through a side exit, but they followed. The chase led through the winding streets of the old town, across the Charles Bridge, up toward the Castle District. Viktor's hunters were skilled, working together with practiced coordination, cutting off escape routes and driving him toward a predetermined kill zone. But Viktor knew Prague better than any vampire could who had only studied maps. He led them into the maze of passages beneath the castle, ancient tunnels that dated back to the city's founding. In the darkness below ground, Viktor's advantages multiplied. He had perfect vision in the absence of light, and he had spent decades exploring these tunnels. His pursuers, trained by the Bloodline's formal methods, fought with precision, but without creativity. Viktor used the environment, collapsing sections of tunnel, igniting stored gunpowder from the last war, setting traps that would have been obvious to a more experienced fighter, but caught vampires who had never needed to think tactically. He destroyed 2 of them and drove the 3rd into retreat, but the victory felt hollow. This was only the first wave. Marcus would send more. Katerina found him as dawn approached, in the hidden chamber beneath the tan church where he had first awakened as a vampire. She had intercepted a bloodline communication revealing the full scope of Marcus's plan. It was not just about destroying a few rogue vampires. Marcus intended to use their elimination as justification for a complete reorganization of vampire society in Central Europe, consolidating power and eliminating rivals within the bloodline itself. They were pawns in a larger game. Understanding this changed everything. Viktor and Katerina realized they could not simply run or fight. They needed to expose Marcus's true motives to the Bloodline's council. But doing so required evidence, and obtaining evidence meant getting close to Marcus himself. Katerina proposed a desperate plan. She would allow herself to be captured, carrying false information that would lead Marcus to a supposed gathering of rogue vampires. Viktor would infiltrate the Bloodline's operation during the ambush, gathering proof of Marcus's manipulation. It was dangerous and relied on precise timing, but they saw no alternative. The plan unfolded over several agonizing weeks. Katerina made herself visible in Vienna, leaving traces that the Bloodline's hunters could follow. Viktor shadowed the hunters, learning their methods and routines. When Katerina finally allowed them to corner her in an abandoned monastery outside Salzburg, Viktor was ready. The ambush itself was elaborate. Marcus brought 20 vampires, far more than needed to capture one rogue. He positioned them carefully, clearly intending to eliminate not just Katerina, but anyone who might come to her aid. His paranoia worked against him. Viktor slipped into the monastery during the chaos, using the confusion to access Marcus's temporary headquarters in the crypt below. What Viktor found exceeded his expectations. Marcus kept meticulous records, and in his arrogance, he had documented everything. The papers detailed a decade-long scheme to eliminate rivals within the Bloodline by framing them as sympathetic to rogues. Dimitri's death had been arranged to implicate a council member Marcus wanted removed. The exposure of Viktor and the others served as pretext for a purge Marcus had been planning for years. Viktor took the documents and fled, but not before setting fire to the monastery. The blaze provided enough distraction for Katerina to escape her captors. They reunited in Munich, exhausted and injured, but alive. Getting the evidence to the Bloodline's council proved surprisingly straightforward. Katerina knew the location of their meeting hall in Rome and the protocols for requesting an audience. The council granted it, perhaps curious about what rogues who dared approach them directly might have to say. The council consisted of 7 ancient vampires, the youngest over 800 years old. They listened in silence as Viktor presented the evidence, their faces showing nothing. When he finished, they dismissed him and Katerina without comment. For 3 months, nothing happened. Viktor returned to Prague, uncertain whether they had succeeded or merely postponed their destruction. Then word arrived through the vampire underground. Marcus had been executed for attempting to manipulate the council. His followers had been scattered. The council issued a rare decree stating that rogue vampires who maintained secrecy and caused no trouble would be left alone, though not welcomed into bloodline society. It was not acceptance, but it was survival. Viktor spent the next century in relative peace. The world changed around him with accelerating speed. He watched the revolutions of 1848 sweep across Europe. He saw the rise of nationalism, the unification of Germany and Italy, the slow decline of the Austrian Empire. Wars came and went, each more destructive than the last. Through it all, Viktor pursued his studies. The advancement of science opened new avenues of investigation. He learned chemistry and began analyzing vampire blood with increasingly sophisticated techniques. He studied biology and came to understand that vampire transformation worked by introducing a complex viral-like entity that restructured cellular processes. He investigated physics and wondered if the strange properties of vampire blood might represent a previously unknown state of matter. The 20th century brought unprecedented challenges. World War I shattered the old order, killing millions and redrawing the map of Europe. Viktor found himself in a unique position to help, using his medical knowledge and vampiric abilities to save soldiers who would otherwise have died. He worked in field hospitals, performing surgery with inhuman precision, never eating, never sleeping, saving lives through sheer tireless effort. He encountered other vampires during the war. Most kept to themselves, viewing the conflict as a human affair. But some saw opportunity in the chaos. They fed freely among the dying, built power bases amid the collapse of empires, and positioned themselves to profit from the new order. Viktor met a vampire named Sarah in a hospital near Verdun. She had been a nurse before her transformation in 1878, and she shared his conviction that their powers imposed moral obligations. They worked together through the final years of the war, and when it ended, she returned with him to Prague. Their relationship defied easy categorization. Sarah became his companion, his colleague, his closest confidant, but never quite his lover. Vampires could experience physical pleasure, but the blood hunger twisted intimacy into something potentially dangerous. They maintained careful boundaries, finding connection in shared purpose rather than physical closeness. Together, they established what they called the sanctuary, a clinic that offered medical care to people who could not afford it or could not risk visiting official hospitals. The sanctuary served the marginal populations of Prague, criminals, refugees, people hiding from authorities or fleeing from danger. Viktor and Sarah asked no questions and kept no records. They treated injuries and illnesses, took blood only with permission and in amounts that would not harm, and sent people on their way. The sanctuary became an institution in Prague's underworld. Criminals trusted it as neutral ground. Refugees knew they could find help there. Even some police officers turned a blind eye, recognizing that the sanctuary reduced suffering and violence. The arrangement continued through the interwar period, through the rise of fascism, through the occupation of Czechoslovakia. Viktor and Sarah maintained their work even as the world descended into another catastrophic war. They treated resistance fighters and wounded civilians, hidden Jews and deserting soldiers, always maintaining their precarious neutrality. The Holocaust forced Viktor to confront the limitations of his careful non-interference. He watched people dragged from their homes to the Theresienstadt ghetto, to the trains that carried them east to death camps. His vampiric nature gave him power to resist, to fight, to kill the perpetrators. But using that power openly would expose what he was, would bring destruction not just on himself, but on everyone the sanctuary protected. He and Sarah saved who they could in small hidden ways. They provided false papers, smuggled people across borders, used their medical cover to extract targets from transport lists. It was never enough. The scale of the killing exceeded anything individual action could meaningfully oppose. Viktor encountered a bloodline representative in 1943, a vampire named Heinrich who had embedded himself in the SS. Heinrich argued that vampires should remain neutral in human conflicts, that taking sides would expose their existence and bring destruction on all their kind. Viktor listened to this argument and then broke Heinrich's neck, dragging him into sunlight and watching him burn. It was the first vampire Viktor had deliberately killed since the fight with the bloodline enforcers in 1789. It would not be the last. He and Sarah began hunting vampires who used the war to feed and profit, who participated in the killing, who treated the Holocaust as an opportunity. They destroyed 7 vampires over 2 years, always careful to make it look like accidents or human violence. The war ended. Prague fell under Soviet control. The communist government brought new dangers and new forms of persecution, but also stability of a sort. Viktor and Sarah continued their work, adapting to the new political reality. Decades passed. The Cold War settled into grim routine. Viktor watched humanity develop weapons capable of destroying all life on Earth and wondered if the vampire's curse of immortality might soon become moot. He saw the moon landing, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of the internet. The world accelerated, change coming faster than even his 3-century perspective could fully process. Sarah left in 1989, wanting to see what would happen in the newly free Eastern Europe. She promised to return, but Viktor understood that promises made by immortals carried different weight. She might return in a year, a decade, or a century. Time meant something different when you had endless amounts of it. Viktor continued alone. He modernized the sanctuary, incorporating new medical technology while maintaining its essential character. He studied the latest developments in genetics and molecular biology, trying to understand vampire transformation through the lens of contemporary science. He filled hard drives with data instead of notebooks, but the fundamental questions remained unchanged. In 2015, Viktor encountered another rogue vampire. The young woman appeared at the sanctuary with injuries that could only have come from a fight with her own kind. Her name was Elena, and her story followed a now familiar pattern. She had been turned without explanation, abandoned to figure out her nature alone, and then hunted by the bloodline when she failed to follow rules she had never been taught. Viktor took her in, taught her what he knew, and gave her the choice about what kind of vampire she wanted to become. Elena chose to stay, to learn medicine, to work at the sanctuary. She brought an energy and hope that Viktor had not felt in decades. She believed their work mattered, that they could make a genuine difference. Her optimism proved infectious. Viktor began to think beyond mere survival and studied problems again. He investigated the question that had nagged at him for centuries. Could vampire transformation be reversed? Could someone made immortal choose to become mortal again? The research consumed him. He studied the mechanisms of vampire blood, the way it rewrote cellular processes and maintained its patterns across time. He experimented with cultures and compounds, trying to find something that might disrupt the vampire state without killing the host. Progress came slowly, measured in small insights accumulated over months and years. Viktor discovered that vampire blood maintained its patterns through a kind of distributed information storage, with each molecule carrying a complete template for the whole. Disrupting the pattern in one area simply caused it to rebuild from elsewhere. To reverse transformation, he would need to disrupt the pattern everywhere simultaneously. He developed a compound that showed promise in culture, a combination of engineered proteins and targeted toxins that could theoretically break down vampire blood. But testing it would require a volunteer willing to risk death. Viktor was not willing to ask that of anyone, not even himself. Elena eventually suggested the obvious solution: find a vampire who wanted to die. There were more of them than Viktor had realized. Immortality sounded appealing in theory, but the reality ground people down. Some vampires grew tired after centuries, finding existence more burden than gift. They lacked the courage or means to end themselves, but would welcome an alternative. Through the vampire underground, Viktor made contact with a vampire named Thomas who had lived for 400 years and wanted to stop. Thomas had been a sailor turned in 1623, and he was tired. He had seen everything he wanted to see, experienced everything that interested him, and found himself going through motions out of habit rather than desire. He volunteered for Viktor's experiment. The procedure took place in the sanctuary's basement laboratory on a winter night in 2019. Viktor administered the compound through transfusion, replacing Thomas's vampire blood with the treatment over the course of 6 hours. Elena monitored vital signs while Viktor watched for any indication of success or failure. For a time, nothing seemed to happen. Then Thomas began to change. His skin lost the peculiar quality that marked vampires, becoming warmer and taking on natural color. His heartbeat, maintained by vampire blood for 4 centuries, became irregular and then steadied into a human rhythm. His breathing, unnecessary for a vampire but maintained out of habit, became essential again. By dawn, Thomas was mortal. He looked older, showing his actual age of around 35 rather than the ageless appearance vampire blood maintained. He could feel hunger and thirst, fatigue and warmth, sensations he had not experienced in 400 years. He wept, and his tears were red with blood that was now fully human. Thomas lived for 3 more years, cramming experiences into every moment. He traveled to places he had never seen, ate foods he had not tasted in centuries, reconnected with distant mortal relatives who believed he was a descendant of the original Thomas. He died in his sleep in 2022 of heart failure at the equivalent of 435 years old. His last letter to Viktor expressed gratitude for giving him back his mortality and the chance to die on his own terms. The successful experiment changed Viktor's perspective. He had proven that vampire transformation could be reversed, that immortality was a choice rather than an inescapable curse. The knowledge itself felt liberating, even though Viktor had no immediate intention of using it on himself. Word of the experiment spread through the vampire underground. Some vampires expressed interest in the treatment. Others condemned it as unnatural, arguing that immortality was a gift that should be preserved. The bloodline issued a formal prohibition against the treatment, declaring it a violation of vampire nature. Viktor ignored them. He refined his procedure and offered it to any vampire who genuinely wanted to return to mortality. Over the next few years, he transformed 17 vampires back into humans. Most lived out relatively normal lives. A few died quickly, whether from accidents or from bodies that could not adapt to suddenly being mortal again after centuries. The work brought Viktor into conflict with the bloodline again. They viewed the mortality treatment as an existential threat, something that could undermine the foundations of vampire society. If vampires could choose to become mortal, could choose to escape the blood hunger and the endless night, then what was the point of the careful hierarchy and control the bloodline had built? In 2024, the Bloodlines Council summoned Viktor to Rome. The summons was phrased as a request but carried the clear implication of force if he refused. Viktor went, curious to see what the ancient powers wanted. The council had changed since his last appearance in 1867. 3 of the original 7 members remained, supplemented by 4 newer additions, though newer in this context meant turned sometime in the 15th century. They questioned Viktor for hours about his treatment, his methodology, his intentions. They seemed less concerned with the specifics than with the implications. Finally, the eldest council member, a vampire who claimed to have been turned in the 4th century during the decline of Rome, asked the question that drove everything else. What did Viktor want? Not in the immediate sense, but in the long term. What was his vision for vampire existence? Viktor answered honestly. He wanted vampires to have choices. He wanted them to be able to exist without participating in hierarchy or following rules that served ancient powers rather than individual needs. He wanted them to be able to feed without killing, to live without hiding, to die if they chose. He wanted vampires to be people rather than monsters, regardless of what the bloodline preferred. The council deliberated for 3 nights. When they recalled Viktor, they offered a compromise. He could continue his work under specific conditions. He would not advertise the treatment or actively recruit vampires to become mortal. He would maintain detailed records that the bloodline could review. He would accept bloodline oversight of his research. In exchange, the bloodline would not interfere with his sanctuary or harm those who chose to use his treatment. Viktor accepted, knowing the compromise was imperfect but recognizing it as progress. The council was acknowledging, however reluctantly, that vampires could choose their own paths. He returned to Prague and continued his work. Elena had grown into a skilled physician in her own right, capable of running the sanctuary independently. They discussed expanding, establishing other sanctuaries in other cities, creating a network of places where vampires and humans could coexist peacefully. The project consumed their nights. Viktor reached out to other rogue vampires, to those who had survived outside the bloodline's control, to those who shared his vision of a different way of existing. The response surprised him. Dozens of vampires across Europe expressed interest. Some were ancient, others newly made, but all of them wanted something beyond the binary choice between bloodline hierarchy and isolated survival. By 2025, Viktor had established 7 sanctuaries across Central Europe. Each operated independently but shared resources and information. Each offered medical care to marginal populations. Each harbored vampires who chose to feed without killing. Each represented a small experiment in different possibilities. The bloodline watched with what Viktor interpreted as nervous suspicion. They had agreed to allow his work but clearly worried about where it might lead. Viktor understood their concern. He was building something that could potentially rival the bloodline's authority, not through force but through offering an alternative. In the fall of 2025, Katerina reappeared. Viktor had not seen her since the 1920s, though they had exchanged occasional messages. She had been traveling, she explained, studying vampire societies across the world, learning how different groups had organized themselves in different places. What she had discovered fascinated Viktor. The bloodline was only one of many vampire organizations. In Asia, vampires followed completely different patterns of organization and behavior. In Africa, they integrated into existing religious and social structures. In South America, they had developed unique relationships with indigenous populations. Each system had its own logic, its own justification, its own way of managing the fundamental problem of predators living among prey. Katerina believed the time had come to challenge the bloodline's claim to speak for all vampires. Not through violence, but through demonstrating alternatives. Viktor's sanctuaries represented one such alternative. Others existed in different forms across the world. What was needed was communication, coordination, and mutual support. She proposed a gathering, a meeting of vampires from different traditions and organizations, to share knowledge and discuss cooperation. Viktor saw the value immediately. He offered to host it in Prague, in the hidden chamber beneath the Tan Church where he had first awakened as a vampire nearly 5 centuries earlier. The gathering took place over 3 nights in December 2025. 47 vampires attended, representing 9 different organizational traditions from 6 continents. They spoke different languages, followed different customs, and held different beliefs about vampire nature and purpose. But they all shared a desire for something beyond isolation or domination. The discussions ranged across every aspect of vampire existence. They debated ethics and feeding, creation and destruction, secrecy and revelation. They shared techniques and knowledge, comparing different approaches to common problems. They argued and disagreed, sometimes fiercely, but they also listened and learned. By the gathering's end, they had established what they called the Accord, a loose agreement on principles rather than rules. Vampires who joined the Accord committed to maintaining secrecy, feeding without killing, creating new vampires only deliberately and with the intention of teaching them and respecting each other's autonomy. Beyond those basic commitments, each vampire or group could organize as they saw fit. The Accord represented everything the bloodline opposed: decentralization, choice, flexibility, change. Viktor knew the bloodline would see it as a threat, but he also believed they would not immediately move against it. The Accord included too many powerful vampires, represented too many different traditions, and enjoyed too much distributed support to be easily suppressed. He was wrong. The attack came in January 2026, targeting all 7 sanctuaries simultaneously. Bloodline forces struck with overwhelming power, clearly intending to destroy the infrastructure of Viktor's network before the Accord could consolidate. The Prague sanctuary survived only because Viktor had spent centuries learning to defend it. The others fell. 16 vampires died in the attacks, along with dozens of human staff and patients. The sanctuaries in Vienna, Budapest, and Warsaw were completely destroyed. The others suffered heavy damage. Elena was killed defending the Berlin location, fighting bloodline enforcers to give staff and patients time to escape. Viktor received word of her death through the network's emergency communication system. He felt the loss like a physical blow, a pain that cut through centuries of emotional armor. Elena had been young, barely a decade old as a vampire, but she had shown him hope and possibility he had thought lost. Her death made the stakes of the conflict brutally clear. The bloodline had made its position known. There would be no alternatives, no choices, no change. They would maintain their control regardless of cost. Viktor faced a decision. He could retreat, rebuild in secret, accept that progress would be measured in centuries rather than years. Or he could fight, accepting that fighting would mean becoming the kind of vampire he had spent 500 years avoiding. He chose a third path. Viktor called an emergency meeting of the Accord's founding members. 23 vampires gathered in Prague, angry and grieving and ready for war. Viktor proposed something different. Instead of fighting the bloodline directly, instead of matching their violence with his own, he would offer them what they claimed to want most: proof that alternatives to their system could work. He would make the Accord's success so undeniable, so obviously superior, that even the bloodline would have to acknowledge it. He would build not just sanctuaries, but a complete alternative society, one that offered vampires everything the bloodline provided without the hierarchy and control. He would demonstrate that vampires could maintain secrecy, survive comfortably, and even thrive while respecting each other's autonomy. The proposal met skepticism. How could they build openly when the bloodline was actively trying to destroy them? How could they succeed when the bloodline controlled most vampire resources and commanded loyalty through centuries of tradition? Viktor's answer was simple. They would use the advantage that came from being right. The bloodline maintained power through fear and tradition, but it could not offer what young vampires actually wanted: community, support, understanding, and choice. The Accord could offer those things. They just needed to survive long enough for the difference to matter. The work began immediately. Viktor coordinated with Accord members across Europe to establish hidden safe houses and communication networks. They created a system for supporting newly turned vampires, teaching them without demanding obedience. They developed protocols for feeding that minimized harm and maximized sustainability. They built slowly and carefully, learning from each setback, adapting to each new challenge. The bloodline continued their attacks, but the Accord proved resilient. Every time the bloodline destroyed one node of the network, 2 more appeared. Every vampire the bloodline killed or drove into hiding weakened their own claim to speak for vampire interests. The bloodline's brutal tactics began to alienate even their own members. By spring, the conflict had reached a stalemate. The bloodline could not eliminate the Accord without revealing vampire existence to human authorities. The Accord could not openly challenge the bloodline without triggering a war that would destroy both sides. They circled each other warily, looking for advantage. Viktor spent his nights rebuilding the Prague sanctuary, and his days documenting everything he had learned about vampire biology and society. If the bloodline killed him, he wanted his knowledge to survive. He compiled centuries of observations and experiments into a comprehensive text, covering everything from the molecular mechanisms of transformation to the social dynamics of vampire communities. He called it the Vampire's Codex, and he distributed copies throughout the Accord network. It represented his life's work, his attempt to bring reason and science to a condition that defied both. It offered future vampires a foundation to build on, a starting point that might spare them some of the trial and error he had endured. In writing it, Viktor realized he had accomplished something he never quite intended. He had become a kind of maker, not through transforming humans into vampires, but through teaching vampires how to exist consciously and ethically. His true offspring were not the handful of humans he had turned over the centuries, but the dozens of vampires he had mentored and the hundreds he had influenced through his work. The Codex spread beyond the Accord, passed from vampire to vampire through underground channels. Even some bloodline members read it, though they never acknowledged doing so publicly. Viktor received messages from vampires across the world, thanking him for articulating ideas they had felt but could not express, for validating choices they had made in isolation. The response gave Viktor hope that change was possible, that vampire society could evolve despite the bloodline's resistance. But he also understood that real change would take time measured in centuries. He had lived long enough to know that institutional powers did not fall quickly. In early summer, Katerina brought news that shifted the balance. She had made contact with the second eldest member of the Bloodlines Council, a vampire named Livia, who had been turned in the 6th century. Livia was tired of the conflict and worried about where it was leading. She believed the bloodline needed to adapt or face eventual destruction, but she could not propose change openly without being seen as weak. Katerina suggested a secret meeting between Viktor and Livia, a chance to discuss possibilities away from the pressures of their respective positions. Viktor agreed, curious about what the bloodline's second eldest might offer. They met in neutral territory, a cave system in the Alps that neither side controlled. Livia arrived alone, as Viktor did, both of them trusting that the other valued this conversation too much to waste it on violence. Livia proved surprisingly pragmatic. She explained that the Bloodlines Council was divided. 3 members wanted to escalate the conflict until the Accord was completely destroyed. 3 others believed some accommodation was necessary. She represented the 7th vote, the one that could break the deadlock in either direction. She offered Viktor a deal. The Accord would be allowed to exist and operate freely, but only if it accepted bloodline oversight. The bloodline would not control the Accord's operations, but they would audit its activities and have the power to intervene if secrecy was compromised, or if vampires were created carelessly. In exchange, the bloodline would provide protection and resources, incorporating the Accord as a subsidiary organization. Viktor recognized the offer as both genuine compromise and subtle trap. Accepting would give the Accord legitimacy and safety, but it would also acknowledge the bloodline's ultimate authority. Refusing would mean continued conflict with an organization that had deeper resources and longer reach. He asked for time to consult with the Accord's members. Livia granted him a month. The debate within the Accord consumed weeks. Some members saw the offer as surrender, a betrayal of everything they had fought for. Others recognized it as the best outcome they could realistically achieve. The discussion went in circles until Viktor proposed a different question. What did they actually want to accomplish? If the goal was to destroy the bloodline and replace it with something new, then Livia's offer was indeed surrender. But if the goal was to create space for vampires to choose their own paths, then the offer might serve that purpose. Under bloodline oversight but not control, the Accord could continue its work while gaining stability and resources. The vote was narrow, but the Accord accepted Livia's terms. They would become a recognized subsidiary of the bloodline, maintaining autonomy in their operations while acknowledging the bloodline's broader authority over vampire affairs. The arrangement was formalized in Rome, in the same chamber where Viktor had presented evidence against Marcus over a century earlier. The council accepted the accord as a legitimate variation within vampire society, no longer rogue but alternative. They granted Viktor the title of Accord's first architect, a position of authority within the bloodline's hierarchy equivalent to a regional overseer. Viktor accepted the title with mixed feelings. He had spent 5 centuries avoiding exactly this kind of official position. But he recognized that sometimes progress required compromise. The Accord could do more good working within the system than fighting against it, at least for now. The years that followed brought unexpected stability. The Accord rebuilt its sanctuaries and expanded its operations with bloodline resources. Viktor established training programs for newly turned vampires, created emergency response networks for vampires in crisis, and developed his mortality treatment to the point where it could reliably and safely reverse transformation. He also continued his scientific work, now with access to bloodline laboratories and centuries of accumulated data. He made breakthrough after breakthrough, understanding vampire biology at depths previously impossible. He discovered that vampire transformation worked through a form of biological quantum entanglement, with patterns maintained across space through mechanisms that physics was only beginning to understand. The research suggested possibilities that Viktor barely dared consider. If vampire blood maintained its patterns through quantum effects, might it be possible to manipulate those patterns deliberately? Could vampires be engineered to not require human blood to survive on synthesized nutrients? Could the transformation be modified to preserve mortality while granting other benefits? He began experiments carefully, knowing the implications were enormous. A vampire who did not need to feed on humans would fundamentally change the ethics of vampire existence. A transformation that granted superhuman abilities without immortality would appeal to humans in ways that traditional transformation never could. The work attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Human governments had long known about vampires, maintaining elaborate systems of secrecy and accommodation. They tolerated vampire existence because vampires maintained their own secrecy and presented manageable threat levels. But the prospect of modified transformation interested them greatly. Viktor received an invitation from the European Union to discuss his research. The meeting took place in Brussels, with representatives from a dozen governments listening as he explained the potential for transformation without traditional bloodlust. They asked questions about applications, control, and risks. They suggested funding levels that exceeded anything Viktor had worked with before. He declined their offer. The resources were tempting, but the implied cost was clear. They wanted him to develop transformation as a tool for their purposes, creating super soldiers or intelligence agents, or whatever application they imagined. They wanted to control who got transformed and how the abilities were used. Viktor explained that his research aimed to expand choice, not enable new forms of control. He would continue his work independently, sharing results openly once they were proven safe. If governments wanted to develop their own programs, they were free to try, but he would not participate in turning transformation into a weapon. The refusal caused tension. Some governments suggested that they could compel his cooperation. Viktor reminded them that he had survived 5 centuries by being very difficult to compel, and that attempting to force him would cost more than they could afford to pay. The implicit threat satisfied them, at least temporarily. Meanwhile, the accord continued to grow. Vampires who had lived in isolation for decades or centuries emerged to join. Young vampires found community and support instead of predation and fear. The sanctuary served thousands of people, vampire and human alike, creating zones where the two populations could interact with mutual benefit. Viktor watched it all with something approaching contentment. He had not solved every problem or answered every question. The bloodline still existed and still enforced rules he disagreed with, Vampires still struggled with the ethical implications of their existence. The world still contained vast suffering that no amount of immortality or supernatural power could eliminate. But he had created something lasting. He had demonstrated that vampires could choose to exist differently, could build communities based on cooperation rather than hierarchy, could use their abilities to reduce suffering rather than cause it. The Accord would outlive him, continuing and evolving long after he chose to become mortal or met his end in some other way. Sarah returned in the winter of 2026, appearing at the Prague sanctuary as suddenly as she had left 37 years earlier. She had been traveling through Asia, she explained, learning from vampire traditions that predated the bloodline by millennia. She brought knowledge of techniques and philosophies that offered new perspectives on old problems. Viktor welcomed her return, finding their partnership as natural as it had been decades earlier. They fell into comfortable rhythms, working side by side in the sanctuary, discussing research late into the night, navigating the complexities of Accord administration together. One night, as they stood on the Charles Bridge, where Viktor had first met Katerina nearly 2 centuries earlier, Sarah asked him the question that had been building for years. Did he ever want to become mortal again? He had developed the treatment, had perfected it to the point where it was completely safe. He could choose to end his immortality anytime he wanted. Viktor considered carefully before answering. Part of him was tired, worn down by centuries of existence and struggle. Part of him wanted the simplicity of a finite life, the clarity of knowing his time was limited. But part of him remained curious about what would come next, what new discoveries and changes the future would bring. He told Sarah that he was not ready yet. There was still work to do, still questions to answer, still vampires who needed the support and guidance he could provide. Perhaps someday he would choose mortality. Perhaps he would simply continue until something or someone ended him. But for now, he would keep going. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. She had known his answer before asking, had asked more to confirm than to discover. She told him she felt the same way, that immortality remained more gift than curse as long as they used it for something worthwhile. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the river flow beneath the ancient bridge, watching the city they had protected for so long sleep in the hours before dawn. 500 years had passed since Viktor woke as a vampire in the crypt beneath the town church. 500 years of learning and struggling, of mistakes and discoveries, of death and unlikely survival. He had been 28 years old for 5 centuries. He had watched empires rise and fall, technologies emerge and become obsolete, ideas that once seemed eternal revealed as temporary. He had seen humanity at its best and worst, had participated in both, had tried to tip the balance however slightly toward light rather than darkness. The work would continue. New vampires would need teaching, new crises would demand response, new questions would require investigation. The bloodline would push back against changes they feared. Governments would seek to exploit what they did not understand, and simple entropy would erode whatever structures he and others built. But Viktor had learned patience. He had learned that meaningful change happened slowly, that setbacks were inevitable, that progress came in forms too subtle to recognize until years had passed. He had learned that immortality's real gift was not endless life, but endless opportunities to try again, to learn from failure, to incrementally improve. As the sky began to lighten with approaching dawn, Viktor and Sarah retreated to the sanctuary. They had patients to treat, research to continue, vampires to mentor, and problems to solve. The work was never finished, but that was precisely what made it worthwhile. Viktor had been searching for 500 years to understand what it meant to be a vampire, to reconcile the curse of bloodlust with the possibility of conscious choice. He had not found complete answers, but he had found something perhaps more valuable, a way to live with the questions, to exist in the tension between monster and person, to choose deliberately and repeatedly what kind of creature he would be. The night would end, as all nights did. But there would be other nights, countless nights, each offering new possibilities and new choices. Viktor would face them as he had faced the last 500 years, with curiosity, determination, and the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving when survival seemed impossible. He had been 28 years old for 5 centuries. He would be 28 years old for as long as he chose to continue. And in that eternal present, he would keep trying to build something better, something that justified the gift and curse of immortal existence. The story was not finished. It would never be finished. But that was the point. Viktor had learned to find meaning not in conclusions, but in the ongoing struggle, not in final answers, but in better questions. He was a vampire, a creature of night and blood, but he was also a physician, a scientist, a teacher, and a builder. He contained multitudes, contradictions, possibilities. As dawn broke over Prague and Viktor descended into the sanctuary's protected depths, he carried with him the weight and gift of 500 years. Behind him stretched a history of mistakes and triumphs, losses and victories, failures and hard-won progress. Ahead of him lay infinity, or at least enough time to count as infinite by any human measure. He would use it well. He would keep learning, keep building, keep choosing to be something more than the curse that had made him. He would honor Elena's memory and Sarah's partnership and Katerina's vision. He would maintain the accord and challenge the bloodline and push the boundaries of what vampires could be. He would survive. He would adapt. He would endure. He was Viktor Moravec. He had been 28 years old for 5 centuries. And his story continued.